The first faint breath of dawn crept across the wild plains like a shy confession, its soft gold brushing over the cedar posts of Colton Reyes's cabin as though trying not to startle the world awake. The wind held a hush inside it, a hush that seemed to carry a truth no one had spoken yet, and against the pale horizon stood the fragile silhouette of Nayeli Thorne, age 20, holding a small bundle close to her chest. Her moccasins were powdered with dust, her long dark braids trembling in the early light as if they, too, hesitated to follow the decision her feet had made. She looked like someone who had almost convinced herself she deserved nothing, no home, no belonging, no soft corner of the world carved for her. She whispered into the breeze, her voice thin as spider silk, "I'll leave at dawn. I'm nothing but a weight." The words shivered through the air, unsure whether they wished to be heard or buried. Behind her, the wooden door opened with a low creak, letting out the warm lantern glow and the quiet shape of Colton Reyes, age 30, whose presence always felt like an anchor dropped into shifting sand. His boots were scuffed from years on the trail, his flannel shirt rumpled from a restless night, but there was something in his gaze that stayed steady as stone. He stepped closer, almost as if approaching a frightened animal that might bolt if touched too quickly. "Nayeli," he murmured, his voice thick with a fear he rarely let anyone hear, "you don't have to go. Stay where you're safe." But the sun kept rising behind her, and she kept trembling, as though the daylight itself might push her farther from the one place she never thought she'd find, a home. She had spent too much of her life walking alone across lands that had no patience for mercy. Born into a tribe that later turned its back on her, she'd learned early that an orphan girl was an easy target for suspicion. When a precious item vanished from the chief's tent, the blame fell on her with cruel swiftness, and even her cries of innocence sounded to them like wind passing through empty reeds. They cast her out before winter ended. She remembered standing on the edge of her village, clutching nothing but a satchel and a quiet ache in her chest, and wondering how a person could be punished for a crime they never had the chance to understand. Since then, every settlement, every ranch, every small town had shown her the same wary eyes, the kind that said, "Not you. Not here." She kept walking until she nearly collapsed outside Colton's land, where he found her shivering like a wounded fawn and brought her inside without pause. And yet, even kindness frightened her more than cruelty sometimes, because she didn't know what to do with something so fragile and undeserved. Colton had given her shelter, warmth, work to do if she wanted it, not as charity but as a natural extension of his quiet heart. She tended the cabin, cooked simple meals, kept the porch swept, and in every small act she performed, she tried to repay him silently for what she believed she owed. But each time he placed another piece of firewood by her door or left extra blankets folded neatly for her, she worried she was draining the goodness from him drop by drop. She feared she was turning his generosity into burden. She feared someone like her could only ever be trouble to someone like him. And she feared, most painfully, that staying might break him in ways leaving never could. Still, there were moments, small, fleeting embers, when she caught him watching her with a softness that unsettled her heart. When she burned her hand on the stove once, he had moved so quickly that the world blurred, pressing a cool cloth to her skin with hands that trembled far more than hers. When she hung her braids to dry after washing them, he lingered at the doorway and looked away only when she glanced back at him. And every evening, when the sky bled into violet, he made sure to return early, as if the day was incomplete unless he saw her standing somewhere inside his home. Those gestures frightened her more than cruelty ever had, not because he meant harm, but because she sensed his affection growing and feared she had nothing to offer in return. In town, whispers began to coil like restless serpents. Ridgewater Crossing was not a place that welcomed change, and a native girl living under the roof of a well-regarded cowboy became a story they decided to write themselves. "He's lost his mind," some muttered. "Protecting a stray will ruin him," said others. And then came the harsher murmurs, the ones that quieted when she passed but burned into her back all the same. "She doesn't belong. She'll bring trouble." Drive her out. The sheriff, Elias Boone, approached Colton outside the general store one afternoon, his jaw tight. Reyes, folks are uneasy. They want her gone. This is the last time I ask politely. Drive her off your land. Don't make this harder. The words dropped heavily in the dust at their feet. Nayeli had been standing behind the stacked barrels of grain, her breath lodged somewhere painful between her ribs. She felt the familiar sting of rejection, a sensation that had carved itself into her bones like a brand. Leaving, she thought, might be the only way to save him from the storms that followed her everywhere. As she pressed her palm against the wood of the barrel, something inside her whispered the same old familiar story. Run. Disappear. Spare him the weight of you. But Colton turned toward the sheriff with a fire she had never seen in him. She stays, he said, voice low but unwavering. This is my land, my home, and I won't let fear or ignorance dictate who belongs here. The sheriff stared at him, taken aback, as townspeople watched with widened eyes. Nayeli's throat tightened so sharply she could barely breathe. Colton rode home that evening with a storm behind him, dark clouds pushing the wind faster, dust curling around his horse's legs like restless spirits. Nayeli stood in the doorway as he dismounted, expecting anger, disappointment, anything that would confirm the fears she carried. Instead, his eyes softened as he looked at her, as if returning home meant returning to the only truth that mattered. He brushed the dust from his sleeves, stepped close enough that she could feel the heat of him, and said nothing at first. Words felt too fragile. She finally whispered, I never meant to cause you trouble. He didn't reach for her, though every muscle in him strained to. You didn't, he replied. They're wrong. Not you. But the silence that followed held more yearning than either dared to admit. That night, she sat by the hearth, the fire casting flickering shapes on her face like hidden memories rising and falling. She had been quiet for so long that the weight of her thoughts seemed to anchor the cabin itself. When Colton finished tending the horses and stepped inside, he saw her sitting small and folded, as though each breath cost her something. He approached softly, lowering himself beside her. Nayeli, he began, voice low, why were you leaving? She looked down at her hands. Because I don't want to be a burden. You already gave me more than I deserve. Colton exhaled sharply, almost in disbelief. More than you deserve? He leaned closer, and she felt the warmth of him press gently into the cold corners of her thoughts. You're not a weight. You're the only light in this house. Tears slipped from her eyes before she could hold them back. He did not wipe them away. He simply stayed beside her until her breathing eased, as though silent presence could mend what words never healed. But the hostility in town grew sharper. A group of ranch hands muttered threats, saying they'd burn down Colton's barn if he didn't get rid of the trouble he'd taken in. The air around Ridgewater Crossing felt charged, like the split-second pause before lightning strike. Nayeli woke each morning with guilt pinching her heart, knowing he might be in danger because of her. She tried to smile while preparing breakfast, tried to hide the tremble in her hands, but Colton saw every flicker of fear. And with each passing day, his protectiveness deepened, not from obligation but from something far more dangerous to hide, love. One evening, when the sky was the color of bruised lavender, she stepped outside with her bundle again, determined to leave before the threats turned into violence. Colton found her halfway across the yard. No, he said, breath uneven as he reached her. She didn't turn. I can't stay and bring ruin to you. He grabbed her hand, not harshly, but with desperation he could no longer contain. Nayeli, look at me. She turned slowly, tears streaking down her cheeks. I love you, he said, voice breaking open. I think I have from the moment I saw you on my porch like a fallen star trying to hide its glow. She gasped softly, almost in disbelief. But I have nothing, she whispered. I am nothing. He cupped her face gently, letting his thumb trace the warmth of her tears. You are everything I never knew my life needed. Stay. Choose me as I choose you. Her breath hitched, her heart trembling under his touch. "If I stay," she whispered, "will I truly be wanted?" His voice softened into a promise, wanted, cherished, protected, loved. Under the rising moon, her quiet yes became the beginning of their forever. Their wedding took place in a meadow outside Ridgewater, framed by wild yellow flowers swaying like witnesses to a long-awaited truth. Nayeli wore a traditional white and brown beaded dress, its patterns echoing stories from her people, and the feathers woven into her braids glimmered softly in the sunlight. Colton wore his best vest, his hands shaking with each breath as he held hers. Only a handful of friends attended, those who saw the world with clearer hearts. The preacher's voice rose like a prayer drifting on wind, wrapping around them as though binding not just their hands, but their broken histories. Colton spoke first, voice rough with emotion. "You were never a weight, Nayeli. You were my dawn. You brought light where I had grown used to shadows." She answered with trembling grace, "You gave me home when I had none. You saw me when the world refused to look. I choose you in this life and every life beyond it." When they kissed, it was slow, aching, and deeply earned, the kind of kiss that felt like mending two halves of the same soul. Life after their vows unfolded like soft petals opening after rain. They shared laughter that warmed the cabin, learned each other's rhythms, danced slowly in the dim glow of lanterns. Colton played guitar by the fire while her head rested on his shoulder. She taught him to bead feathers, his large hands fumbling at first until she guided them with a smile that reached her eyes. In quiet moments, he would brush a stray braid from her face, and she would lean into his touch with a trust she once believed was impossible. Every small gesture became a love letter, every shared breath a promise. At night, wrapped in one blanket, they whispered hopes into the darkness, hopes that felt real now, hopes that belonged to them both. And each morning, he would pull her gently into his arms and murmur, "You were never a weight. You were the reason I learned to stay still long enough to love." Years later, as the plains stretched endlessly beneath sunsets painted with fire and lavender, their love remained a quiet force, steady, enduring, born from wounds but blooming into something unbreakable. Some said the land itself seemed softer around the Reyes cabin, as if the wild earth recognized two souls who had finally found rest. If you stood on that porch at dusk, you might hear the wind whisper a lesson that only hearts who have suffered understand. Sometimes the people who arrive in our lives carrying nothing end up giving us everything. And if you looked closely, you would see Nayeli leaning into Colton's side, her hand tucked in his, both of them watching the horizon as though dawn itself was no longer something to fear but something to welcome, together.